Okay. This one, I read an article today about, it was an opinion piece about the falling male labor participation rate in the United States. And this is kind of happening generally around the world too. And uh, it was, this piece was kind of coming around to the findings of these economists that basically said that when you see that the labor market sucks and is just it's not fun to work and it's hard to get ahead and all that other stuff, especially as you grow as a child, you start to think that maybe working isn't worth it. You think, because there's all these studies that talk about it and they're like, oh, the video games are so good, they'll sit at home and do that instead, or whatever excuse they come up with, other than you're not paying people enough. Anything but the obvious. But it it is interesting because that one's kind of it's a strange metric because it's exclusionary from an entire gender, obviously. So it's not really one that you tend to look at except in terms of demographic, social context, and not really about the market itself. Okay, when we talk about unemployment, we use two numbers that the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, BS is really what they are, not the BLS. Uh, they they have two metrics that we look at. One is U3, and another, much less frequently, is U6. And U3, what that represents is people who are completely out of work, that have lost their job in the last 6 months or just graduated school, and are actively currently looking for full time employment. So that number right now is somewhere around 4%. I don't buy it, first of all. But second of all, the uh, the way they massage that number is to do things like, well, are you working part time? Well, then you're not unemployed. Uh, you know, uh, have you been looking for work for more than 6 months? Well, you're no longer unemployed. You're a discouraged worker, which is to say you're worthless as far as we're concerned. If you can't find work in 6 months, you're done, pal. I guess is kind of how they think about you in that number. U6 includes that kind of stuff where you're working part-time but looking for full-time, you're not getting 40 hours a week, you've been looking for work longer than 6 months, you're actively looking. It's not that you've bailed and truly become discouraged, you haven't found anything for more than 6 months, whatever. That number is usually much higher, as you can imagine. But I think that personally, the male labor participation rate from age 20 to 65 is probably the best barometric we have about the health of the labor market. Now, that sounds a little sexist, I know, but I also think that we can come to an agreement about the fact that, women leave the workforce a lot more frequently, and for the one big obvious reason of maternity, and it's not to say that that's, something that we should compensate for, or, deal with the bit of social injustice there. I'm just saying that the male labor participation rate is not affected by that very drastic biological reality nearly as much. It's not to say there aren't stay-at-home dads and all that other stuff, but from 1950, the male labor participation rate then was 89.5%, roughly, from when they were starting this metric. And most recently, it crossed under 70% to 69.5%. That is 20% more men are not engaged in the labor force at all. They're not working part time. They're not looking for work, is what that number represents. Okay, so what that means is in 1950, you could look out on the street and see 10 men, and of them, one of them would just not be working and not have any pursuit in working, and they're not being educated or any of that other stuff. Why is that? Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. They can be we can go run the gamut. He's independently wealthy and doesn't need to work at all. He just chills for a living. He could be handicapped, or he could be taking care of his mother, or he could be a stay-at-home dad. That is possible, even in 1950. A variety of different reasons for that, but 9 out of 10 men were working in some capacity. They were earning a wage. They were participating in the labor market. Fast forward to 2026, 2025, I think is when they're really getting these numbers from. uh, they Now you got 3 out of 10, just slightly over 3 out of 10 men that you see on the road. Three of them are not working and have no intent to work or participate in the labor market. Now, I'm going to make a stretch here and say that we didn't suddenly have 20% of men become independently wealthy. Now, there are a few more factors. There are more stay at home dads. It's more socially acceptable. Yes. There's maybe because of the 90s, there was an opportunity to become independently wealthy. You're a day trader or something like that. I don't know. Or you sling stuff on eBay or something that's easier now than it was then. But 3 out of 10 men are not participating in the labor force at all and have no intent. And I don't think that speaks to a puritanical need to send people to work. I think that shows, though, that the ability to participate in a way that is remuneratively meaningful has gotten to the point where people just don't bother. Okay. And I have a hard time imagining that. I don't know how you get by without a job. At least that's just somehow or another, people can do it, you know, however they're doing it. I used to work in one particular place in IT called risk management. And we had a system that was kind of a BI system, but it was to track people who were committing schemes, trying to, get a free coat out of the store or whatever, and patterns of behavior. You're starting to track this stuff because people had to bring in their IDs in order to do returns and stuff. And they would often get returns and gift cards and stuff. But there was lots of scamming going on. And you want to catch these people and stop them, is what the system was meant to help do. And you realize how clever people are just to lift $25 worth of good, man. It's like, go work on Wall Street. What are you doing? Don't get thrown into the clink for petty larceny. You're too good at this. You know what I mean? It's kind of what I think when I see that stuff, because there are a lot of people that, they are a bit probably very sociopathic. They don't have that particular bug that tells them what they're doing is wrong, and is feel bad about it. Uh, but they, by hook and by crook, survive this way in kind of, I wouldn't say living off the grid, but living in a way that is not conforming to the social norm, right? There's a lot more of that going on now than there was in 1950. It's not to say there wasn't crime. I'm just saying that there was more opportunity for work, and so more people defaulted to the way that you could earn money. Hasn't always been that way, of course. 20 years before 1950 was 1930, and the unemployment rate hit 25%. And the images we saw, my generation saw in Looney Tunes, which were made in the 1940s and 50s and stuff, had these tropes of the tramp and the hobo with the bindle stick walking down the tracks with the patchwork, coats, and the worn out shoes that they put newspaper in, and boiling shoes for leather to eat and stuff. That was a real thing. These were images that they kind of lampooned, but were actual cultural understandings of what was happening to people in the Great Depression. And we think of it as cartoonish, but it really did happen. So in those circumstances, you're living hand to mouth, and you take work wherever you can get it. And there was a lot of that kind of migrant labor in the wake of the Great Depression, and had been that way kind of for a long time in earlier parts of American history. Um, in During the Industrial Revolution, and this is really what it is, okay? And Karl Marx talks about this and all these other things, but what it is that with industry, with the ability to create machines and um, enhance labor essentially by adding machinery and automation. With an investment of capital, you can take one amount of human unit of labor and exert way more capital production out of that one person. Okay. And that surplus of value skyrockets while the labor value stays the same, and people end up in abject poverty and living in crammed conditions and all these other things like they did in London and New York and stuff. Very unsanitary, very unhealthy. And the kind of work that people were doing was incredibly dangerous, working in mines. In New York City, there's that iconic picture of the guys sitting on the girders, no safety equipment whatsoever. He slip and fall. That was just it. He slipped and fell. You know, he wouldn't get sued for OSHA violations back in 1890. It's not how it worked. And those guys were getting paid per diems. And if they didn't show to work, they didn't get paid or whatever. It was a very loose system of barter, and workers really didn't have any rights. There's a very big reason why there were so many labor related movements in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, because capital started to really improve and people weren't getting a fair share of it. And any of these worker uprisings of some sort is really fighting against that particular dynamic in capitalism. And even in under communism in the Soviet Union, you still had the state capturing the surplus value and keeping it for themselves. So it's just one other way to skin that cat is really all it comes down to. And it's only when labor has an what they would think of as an unfair advantage do we actually make any advancements. A big example, one of the greatest historical examples, was the Black Plague that hit Europe in the 14th century. It wiped out something like a third or a half of that population. The scholars aren't sure, but it was massive. Death was everywhere. Imagine, just imagine, half of the people around you die, dying in the streets from this massive plague that won't go away. And you might get it. You're probably going to get it. Everybody, if your immune system was fortunately strong, you would fight it off, or you would get it and then fight it off, or maybe live a not so great life after your body did finally manage to fight it off and you survived. But what happened, of course, the nobles isolated themselves. We don't let those plague people in here, you know. And while a lot of nobles died too, there's still only one noble, and now half of the labor force that used to be. So now people could actually demand rights, and that broke the back of manorialism that had existed in Europe for 400 or 500 years, maybe longer, depending on how you look at it. And people started to be able to be free to sell their labor to who they wanted to. That was not a thing in Europe for a long time. And but it was only under that very unique circumstance that labor had such strong power that they were able to exert basic human rights at a level that hadn't been seen before. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we saw the same kind of disruption, but in a different way. It's just that there's so much being created by one person that one person not working anymore can have a serious impact, right? In the Middle Ages, you wouldn't even think of sending an army to try to dig a train tunnel that's 5 miles long or whatever. But in the 1800s, you could do that with explosives and stuff. But if those guys just stopped working, that incredible amount of output just suddenly stops too. And so the damage, so to speak, they even call it that, the lost profits. The damage that is done by workers going on strike is financially more significant than it even was in the Middle Ages. So that's why they don't like it. But what happened in the 30s in particular, in the 1910s was a big one. And then in the 1930s, with the Great Depression, you had a whole mob of angry people all pissed off at our current version of nobles, the wealthy bankers on Wall Street, right? And they knew that they had to do something to appease those folks, or things were going to get real hairy in this country real fast. So that's why they came up with the New Deal programs. You know, you had people building dams and bridges and roads and all sorts of crazy stuff. I think even the Blue Ridge, Blue Mountain, whatever the Ridgeway Highway here was just simply a project for people to work on. It doesn't actually have much in the way of value in terms of transporting goods. It's just this scenic view, mountain winding road that is nice. It's a pretty road, and you see some beautiful scenery. There's incredible value to that, and no economic output. It's kind of cool when you think about that. But uh, they put all these folks to work, and that helped limp us along until World War II, when industry started to pick up again, right? Not that the economy did great during World War II because of all the rationing and stuff, but at least people were working and earning a decent wage if they weren't fighting and dying in the fields of Europe or on the islands in the Pacific. The 1950s were a very unique time of prosperity for the United States. And we talk about the boomers and stuff, and this is the big reason why, is because the world was devastated after World War II. Very simple. No one could do what we could do. We had all these resources, we had all these factories. Nothing had been damaged on American turf, except for the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the taking of, the Philippines and that other stuff that are far territories. But our homeland was never attacked. I think they saw German U-boats in the Mississippi. That was the extent of our concerns here in the Western Hemisphere. And so when it came time to put Europe back together and Japan back together and all those other guys, we got to call the shots, and our country, we had all the manufacturing, and we made cars, and we made appliances, and the wave of the future and all these other things. And a man could have a high school diploma and go walk onto the factory floor for a living wage and have a promotional path and stuff. There was a union usually that would be involved with those kinds of jobs, or there's other stuff that wasn't union but still paid well. And to compete for workers, they would add benefits like health insurance, which was a nice to have, right? We talk about healthcare now, which is the costs are out of control because we're poaching from people. But back then, it was a novelty to be able to just, hey, I don't have to pay for a doctor. Cool, you know. And that was a perk of these jobs. And you would get pensions. And the way they integrated people into these companies, it was like you start in the mailroom, you promote yourself, you work here for years. My grandfather worked for Boeing for 35 years. He started on the floor. He became some sort of foreman draftsman of some sort. I don't know what his title was. He had some middle, management slash technical career, and he owned a home and supported his family on that one income. Now they were subsistence farmers. They never shook their Great Depression ways, and they saved every dime. They were very miserly, but they lived a good life on that one job. And he worked there until he was retirement age, and he got his clock and his decorative tool set and his pension, and that lasted into the end of his days. That deal doesn't exist for us anymore. We're reverting back to a per diem economy and a rental economy, where you're a tenant in all shapes and ways. It's all a subscription model. It's they get to hitch into your wallet constantly, and you can't, you buying a home is becoming increasingly difficult for anyone. It's a report that said starter homes are now $1 million in every major city in the United States. That's out of control. That is out of control, unless you're paying people two or $300,000 a year. It is way too expensive to own a home now, and it makes no sense. That's really the issue. And it's been like that in Canada for almost 2 decades now. I've looked at home prices in Vancouver when I was in Seattle and was shocked. at how expensive it is. Now, Vancouver, it is, you know, a delta valley that is surrounded by giant mountains. So there is a geographical constraint, but still, you know, the cost of, I don't know how people make it. As part of the reason why I left the West Coast is all up and down the West Coast, it started to get ridiculously expensive for what you could get out of a wage. And so I came here, which was cheaper. And I knew it when I saw it. I looked at Charlotte and I was like, this is like Seattle in the 90s. This is the time to get in. I was right, because now everything's twice the price it was, you know, and the cost of everything keeps going up, and yet the wages stay the same. I have never made more money than I made in 2010. And I think the last best gig I had since then was 5 years ago, 6 years ago. The complications and the requirements of seniority for the level of work that I do continues to increase, but the wages don't go up. Now, granted, I'm fortunate in, you know, my particular line of work. Not everyone gets to do the kind of thing I do, and demand the remuneration that I do. But I recognize it as I see things. I'm like, I bought a carton of egg whites today, $8. It would take a person earning the minimum wage an hour of their time to buy this carton of eggs, and more than that. That is that's not reasonable. It's not reasonable. You know, I don't know if egg whites are a particularly bad example, but these are the kinds of things when I look at it, I'm like, okay, you know, I'm not thinking in terms of dollars right now. I'm thinking in terms of hours of labor, you know, the units of life that someone must contribute in order to purchase this item. It takes a whole hour to get a thing of egg whites, you know? And this is just a little strange anecdotal example, but it's all around us and we all know it. Rents are going up and up and up and up. And the requirements to get rent, to rent a place, is going up and up. But that's just an answer to the ridiculous cost of housing, you know? And they did not have it that way because they had a unique, prosperous time where the economy, the whole world economy, minus the Soviet bloc and China and stuff, was dependent on us. And of course, things are going to settle out after a while, you know, until war comes again. But that way of living apparently wasn't sustainable because labor has not maintained its power. Now, we all know there is plenty to go around in this country. Elon Musk, with his recent IPO grab bag rug pull crap, becomes the world's first trillionaire. Trillionaire. That is a million millions, right? Something like that. 100,000 millions. It is so much money. You can't even fathom what to do with it. You know, he's a nation unto himself. And that is all being hoarded by one guy who sits on one chair at a time, who sleeps on one bed at a time, who can only live in one place at a time. I'm not going to begrudge anybody their luxuries and enjoying the fruits of your labor, but at what point do you say that's enough? And the problem is our system does not provide a limit to that. You know, we don't have any safeguards to prevent ourselves from getting overrun by guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, you know, and we're aware of it and we can't do much about it. And it really even wouldn't be that big of a deal if there was still plenty to go around, but you can see it just getting hoovered up. You know, they're doing layoffs and then doing stock buybacks and giving themselves $1 billion bonuses and stuff. You know, they're killing us in the labor market and rewarding themselves handsomely with the fruits of our labor. And we are doing nothing to stop it. The gig I was at, um, that I got laid off from, what they did, actually, I didn't let my contract ended. It's more accurate what happened there. Right up the exact day of the year, they didn't renew. Okay, fine. But they, what they told their FTEs was this: okay, look, we can't have you taking vacation during the holidays because we have this deal that we need to retrofit our software to meet, because it's a Medicaid system and we only do Medicare. So we need to retrofit our system to work with Medicaid data. And we need to do it by the end of the year, so we can close this deal. If we don't make it to the end of the year, the deal's off and we all eat it. So normally the policy is that you use it or lose it with your PTO, but we will let you bank it and use it later if you will do this. Okay. So everybody pitched in, and people were working. My boss was working all the time on that particular thing. He was on all hours of the day, weekends, everything. And they make it happen. It goes in on the 26th or the 27th of December. Okay. Well, what we didn't know was that contingent on this deal going through, which we were aware of, this new client, that the whole firm would get bought by private equity. If they landed this deal, this other deal went through. And that was the big cash out that the leadership got. Bam, they're gone all of a sudden. There's a new CEO in charge. And guess what's on her mind? We're going to AI everything and lay everyone off because your 9% growth last year is not good enough. And you know who they went after first? They went after the people with the biggest banks of PTO, because it's this liability on the books that they can, once they fire that person, all that liability goes away. Look at how much we're saving. So all those people with 200, 250 hours of banked PTO, and they said, oh, well, that was the deal with them. That wasn't the deal with us. And they started going after the people with the biggest banks first. I actually strangely was spared. I thought it was for sure. It was like, okay, and then we're out. Contractors go first. No, we didn't go first because they knew how much we were cost them, and it was a weekly expense. They could cut us at any time. These guys were assets, or negative assets on the books. Mean, just mean. But when the CEO got onto a meeting, she started talking in very clear terms. The layoffs are coming. Don't worry. Keep a positive attitude. Keep working hard for the company. Do what you need to do. But yeah, they're coming. So good to meet you all. And the time to stand up at that situation was right there. All I would have taken was somebody. I wasn't going to do it. I was a contractor. All I would have taken was somebody to stand up and just say, you know what? No, I'm not going to do any more work for you. I'm withholding my labor. You don't know these systems. You just bought this place. You're going to run roughshod all over us. No, we're going to work out a deal. You're going to give us severance. You're going to give us time to look for a job or whatever, right? Whatever their demands would be. But that's not what happens. You see all these texts coming in. It's all, oh, that's a tough decision. Oh, sorry. I know it's a hard message to deliver. Good job. The little claps that come up in Teams. The sycophantic behavior to try to hopefully avoid the laser cannon that they're pointing at everybody working there. It doesn't mean that that's going to help you at all. They're not looking. They're looking at how much they're paying you first of all, and they're seeing how many of they can gut. They don't care about your claps. This person's a hatchet man. He's here to do one job and one job only. Get y'all out of here. They can replace you with some offshore resource or AI. But of course, their myopia. So many bad mistakes they made. But the big one was letting people go too fast, and all this stuff that was all just basically baling wire and bubble gum stuck together. Lots of manual intervention in this nutty environment, and some of the stuff doesn't go through. And what happens is the contractual obligations with these clients is if they don't get their stuff, they don't pay. So all of a sudden, all these reports and stuff are getting delivered late. This data's wrong and all this other crap because they're just doing whatever. And in this meeting, last meeting I had like that, the boss, he was so surly. He had just had it. He had just had it with these people. And this big boss is like, "We're going to lose our clients." And his response like, "I'm sorry to hear that. That's a real shame." You could have heard a pin drop with that one, because his point was right. And it's like, you cut three people off of a 5-person team. Don't expect them to do 2.5 times the amount of work that they were doing before. They don't even necessarily know the stuff the other guy was doing. You didn't even give him any time. And my contract ended shortly after, and so that was the end of that. But that is the modern work world. It is, they are ruthless with you. Ever since Jack Welch got in, back in the 80s and 90s with his stupid Six Sigma stuff, just that just poisoned the business culture. They're just ruthless and mean now. They don't care about anything. And what did you do for me lately is basically how corporate America treats you. And they cut you second it makes any financial sense to them. There's no consideration really anymore. Just getting a few weeks notice is a huge blessing now. Places like Europe, they still have protections. You got to give plenty of notice, and you got to get plenty of severance and all this other stuff. You can't just lay people off like that in a place like Europe. Now, I knew a guy who set up a satellite business who was from France. He was ultra conservative for a French person, mildly socially democratic for, for an American. It's kind of interesting. He was a rabid right winger, according to the French political spectrum. Over here, he's just like kind of a tepid Democrat. But anyway, he was really surprised at how easy it was to set up a company here. And you can do anything to these people. Yeah. God bless America, Yannick. But it 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 has only gotten worse as time has gone by. The software IT never unionized when we really should have. For the amount of money these companies are making, the only reason we're able to demand any kind of decent wage is because the amount of surplus from our labor is, I'm sure I've made millions of dollars, in terms of lost, uh, prevented lost revenue, and expedited systems and failed over to new environments that were cheaper to run, and all the other things that I've done in my years. I know I have produced a significant amount of value for the companies that I've worked for. And even in my most basic roles, a lot of the stuff that I'm working on is critical to the business. They can't work if this stuff isn't working, and I fix it. It's not to say no one else can fix it. I'm just saying that it takes a special hand to work with these kinds of systems. It's the way it is. Specialization, maybe. But in my field, they are demanding higher and higher and higher and higher expectations from new hires. I see lots of jobs that want somebody with 10, 15 years of experience for just somebody like me as an individual contributor. They're not asking for a manager or anything crazy. They just want you to have a decade or more of experience. Working with a dude who's very young. And when I say very young, he's in his early to mid 20s, and he just had a baby. He reminds me a lot of me when I was that age. In that regard, he's very engaged in the systems, and he wants to learn, but he doesn't know stuff. And it took me a while to figure out why I was getting frustrated with him. It's not that he's not smart; he just doesn't know. He hasn't encountered this stuff before, and it's been so long since I've worked with a junior, associate like that. I've forgotten what it's like. Everyone I work with is gray hair or bald or whatever, because we've all been in the industry for a long, long time. And that's part of the gig. We're working with very critical systems that, I mean, the company that I've been working with lately, they make something like $4 billion a year off of the arbitrage determined out of this system alone. Now they're cost conscious, but they're also pretty good about not, you know skin flinting and they are cautious with their investing and stuff like that, but they are conservative, and that is a one downside of that is that they're slow to move forward. But the that environment is one of the better ones that I've worked in a long time, where you can predict what's going to happen because the company's got their head on straight, and they're not blinded by quarterly profits. They want to make quarterly profits, of course, but they're thinking more long term. They're thinking about projections. They got all these other things that they're thinking about the actual running of business. They're not just trying to do some scam. Worked with one that was a $300 million car wash operation. It was a private equity fund using it as some sort of financial instrument to do some sort of shenaniganry. Now, there was some improvement that was happening to the properties. They found a system that could actually save on operations. But the way these guys are working, this is the thing, is that everything that they're doing is about percentage. It's not necessarily about outcome. Okay. If I come into a company and let's say it's spending $10 million on workers and I fire half of the staff, I've saved the company $5 million. The dramatic effect that will probably have on the output of the company is not felt for a little while. So what these guys do is they come in, they say, "Oh, you're making a let's say we spend $10 million a year, we're making $15 million of revenue, we're making a $5 million profit." Okay. So I'm making a 50% profit off my investment in this simple example. If I come in and fire half the staff, but still use that old metric that says I made $15 million, now I'm making a profit of $10 million. Now it's a 200% return. Okay. That looks real good on paper. Wow. You saved so much money. And now I can price the stock of this company at a higher rate because, hey, look at the costs, look at the output. So I'm going to charge you this much for this business model. Okay. And they get out of there and cash out before the next guy that picks this thing up realizes the steaming pile that he's got. And the real issue with this is what's happening is that they know they're all playing this game. They know they're all doing this to each other. So you would think that they'd be like, I'm going to be very careful about the companies that I purchase. I'm going to take a look at what they've done. I'm going to take a look at the operations, all that other stuff. That's not what they do. They just look at it and say, well, can I squeeze this lemon a little bit more? That's all they're doing, because they're going to pass that hot potato on to somebody else. By the time it's husked out, the ultimate mark is index funds or pension funds or whatever. Pass that husked out company off to some retirement fund for teachers or whatever, and they got their payday, and the teachers are the ones that eat that. It happens all the time. And they even have built into their business model, every now and again, we're going to pick up a stinker. It's just going to go south for us. That's priced in. It's priced in. So this smash and grab fiasco that private equity is engaged in, like the Toys R Us story. The Toys R Us story, I will try to be very brief with this one because you could go real into the weeds with this one. But effectively, what they did was they had first of all, they had all this negative press that these guys were paying to talk trash about Toys R Us, which was a publicly traded company, so the stock price would get lower. Okay. And the idea behind that, they would also shorten the stock. They would also essentially borrow the stock off the market, sell it at market price with the idea that they would buy back lower. By doing that, they flood the market with additional shares, and that drives the price down in terms of supply and demand. They were also doing what's called naked short selling, which ties in the whole GameStop saga. But what they were doing is they were selling shares that they didn't actually borrow. They just said, "Hey, yeah, I'll pay you Tuesday for a share today," And they did that so much to lower the price of the stock of Toys R Us that they got them boxed into a place where their credit started to be crummy. Well, guess who's going to offer them credit? It's going to be these guys. Well, these guys say in order to get a big old loan to fix whatever it is that you're trying to fix, you're going to need to put a couple of our people on your board. So they do that. And those people on those boards, they are doing everything they can to destroy the company. They're not actually working in shareholder interests. Why? Because the company has sold the company short, and they continue to sell the company short, and they husk it out. They make the company borrow as much money as it can from any other investor that's foolish enough to give them money, every bank or whatever. And once they get that money, they pay that out to their investors, to the equity firm. And so now the equity firm is getting all this loan money that's going to get defaulted on. And the stock eventually goes bankrupt because all the money that it's actually earning is all going towards servicing these loans. And even then, the company just, whatever. And the thing about a short sold stock is when the company is delisted, you never have to pay it back. And you don't pay tax on that. What a great scheme. Bad for any company. There was nothing wrong with Toys R Us. It needed to update its model and do something to catch up with Amazon or whatever. But they were in a decent shape when those guys at Bain Capital came along. That's what they do. That is American capitalism right now. It does not care about the workers. It does not care about profitability. It does not care about anything except the new big scam. AI, here's the thing about it. They're building these massive, massive data centers with their own natural gas power plant to power all these machines, grinding through floating point processing to perform AI and machine learning functions. That is expensive, extremely expensive. Okay. And again, the product is free or the product or whatever. The chat GPT and stuff that's free, it gives me pictures of cats or whatever, D&D pictures and stuff. And it's fun, but I'm not going to pay a bunch of money for that. I might pay $5 a month or something like that, but I'm not going to pay some crazy amount. So it's not the consumers that are going to be using this. So they're saying, well, the businesses will pay. Okay. And sure enough, that's what's happening. This happened during the cloud stuff back in the 2010s, the mid 2000s, the 2010s. Hey, get rid of your data center, move all your stuff to Amazon or to Microsoft. It's cheaper, you just rent it. It's great. You don't have, you have just variable costs. You don't have to have fixed costs and worry about physical property and all that other stuff. We'll handle it for you. First of all, now Microsoft owns your stuff or Amazon owns your stuff. They can do whatever. Second of all, as soon as you're dependent on them, they crank that price up. Suddenly, these things are expensive. Everybody's talking about, oh God, I got to lower my costs. How do I reduce my footprint here? Because when you had a data center, well, you had to pay all that upfront cost. You could use it as much as you like. And as long as you had power to it, you're fine. But the same thing's happening with AI. They're like, hey, you can replace 3 of your staff with AI people, and look how much cheaper it is, $1,000 a month or something. Great. No, now it's 2,000 a month. Now it's 4,000 a month. Now it's 6,000 a month. Hey, this is more expensive than the human being I replaced it with. That's what's coming. Nobody could have predicted. But they're already starting to complain about it. Geez, these tokens are expensive for Claude. Yeah, yeah. You think this stuff's they're going to get you hooked? And now you fired all your people. Now you're dependent on us. You got a subscription or whatever. But these massive data centers are so expensive. I don't know how they think they're going to make any money on it. And I know one person I talked with, she's in fabrication, which is the companies that build these factories, that build these warehouses that house these servers. They told her cost isn't the issue. The deadline is, because they want to be first to market. That is .com speak if I ever heard it, you know. And she said, of course, that's a terrible way to negotiate, but I'll take it. But the thing is that's how they're thinking. They're just throwing as much money as they can at this stuff so that they can be the first and best, because they think this is the new internet or whatever, and they're following the same trap. Pretty soon, there's mark me. In the next 5 to 10 years, they're going to be talking in the terms of dark data centers, just like they did with dark fiber. Overinvest in this stuff, and they're going to have to turn all this stuff off, and it's going to get mothballed. And then hopefully the price of GPUs will come down and I can have a decent PC to game on again. But in the meantime, they're using it as a way to squeeze labor. They're, not only are you having to compete with whatever else is going on, but now you got to compete with the computer that can do your job for you. How much are you willing to get paid when the computer can do it better than you? You know, now I am very skeptical of AI because I have not seen it do anything that does not need to be handheld. I have had it help me write stuff. I have had it help me give me ideas while I'm doing creative stuff. That's always good, but it's cribbing from other places. It's not creative. And when it comes to coding, it does not come up with good solutions most of the time, not for the stuff I do. And it can't do the things I needed to do, like traverse my database and tell me how I can improve its performance. Can't do that. So maybe one day it will. I don't know. But they've been promising us one of the first Microsoft meetings I ever went to. Steve Ballmer was talking about DBAs being phased out. It's still around. Data still needs to get from one place to another, and it's all ugly and it all sucks. I'm working in the bowels of the engine room of all those systems that you're somewhat familiar with. I'm working on banking reporting systems and inventory management systems and payroll systems and all these other systems that you don't really ever think about the area where all that data is stored. And hopefully you never have to. It's kind of my job. Is no news is usually good news from me. And if any executive is talking to me, that's bad sign for me. Something's really gone wrong. It's happened a couple times. But the the means that labor has to fight back against this stuff have been crippled at the knees. You know, I was there was no end of shock to me when the National Rail Workers Union went on strike because of the conditions that they were having to work in. The rails are in terrible shape in a lot of the places. They have terrible hours, mandatory overtime. They're driving all over the place to maintain these things because it's a rail system. It's just awful. I can't imagine what it's like being a train engineer these days. And they finally had enough, and they finally said, you know what, we're going to go on strike. And the president writes a writ, an executive order. No, illegal. You don't get to strike. I got some tepid deal afterwards, but these guys, that was the Democratic president, the person who's supposed to represent labor, did that, and that from there, it's only downhill. We don't have representation for labor short of a handful of loud minority in Congress to even talk about this stuff. And of course, they pay lip service to all sorts of different solutions, but they're steering us away from the obvious. We need to collectively bargain. That is the only power labor ever has, right? And I'm not saying that we need a glorious revolution or anything like that, but we all got to get our act together and realize it's all of us or none of us, and realize that we do have the power. All we have to do is stop working, as a collective. A general strike would do amazing things in this country, and if anyone truly proposes a real general strike, I will participate. I will not work. And that's the only thing I can think of that would actually start moving the sticks. And that's not quite what it was in the Great Depression, but it's the kind of thing that would happen that would show how angry people are about this current state of affairs. We have giant skyscrapers. The F1 races in Monaco, you see all these giant private yachts, and giant airplanes that fly us from continent to continent, and all these luxuries we're surrounded by. And George Carlin put it perfectly. He's like, we have cinnamon floss and people sleeping on the streets. Our priorities are backwards, and it doesn't take much. That's the thing. There's plenty to go around. And I'm not a fan of taxation and all that other stuff. And anybody who knows me, I'm always talking about the libertarian, as much as I'm not hate being associated with that word, but that's kind of the angle I'm shooting from. It's we got to get it together, or it's not going to happen. And we keep putting our head down and taking it. And it doesn't have to be crazy, you know. It just we got to do something to rattle the cage of the upper class so that they get with it and start coughing up some dough. You got enough, Elon. I don't know where you think you're going. You're not going to Mars, okay? You know, realize how crazy that is. The sheer amount of expense for nothing to gain. It's a giant rock out in space. You can't even breathe out there. I don't know what you think you're going to do out there. Explore is fun. Okay, cool. Scientific exploration, yes. No one's moving to Mars. You know, Earth's all we got. Let's take care of it. And you're in a position, Elon, to do something about some of the major problems in this world. And you can still have your cake and eat it too. You got your weird ass vision, you know, and whatever. You can be remembered as a grand hero to humanity. Instead, you're just a giant prick. And the same with Jeff Bezos riding into space with his stupid cowboy hat. Come on, man. You know, have some class. You're the upper class. Act like it. Give us something inspiring. If you're going to take so much of our surplus labor, do something valuable with it for humanity, man. Leave a legacy, if nothing else, for your narcissistic pride. Build a giant statue to yourself. I don't care. As long as you do something awesome for humans, you know? But they don't think like that. That's how they got there in the first place, you know? And it's just a giant pissing match to them. And we let them get away with it. And again, I'm not big on property confiscation. I'm not big on violence or anything like that. But these psychopaths are on the loose. And we got to do something as a society to rein it in. To finally say, look, $999 million, you did it, man. Congratulations. You rolled over the pinball machine. You're done. You know, I don't know the arbitrary number or whatever, how you would enforce that or whatever. But I'm just saying, you know, because you're screwing it up for everybody else, and we all know it. And it doesn't have to be that way. That's the thing that makes us so uneasy about it. You know, we don't have to go bankrupt to get our appendix removed. You know, we can socialize that. There's plenty to go around to make sure that people who really need surgery and medication can get it. You know, people who need help can get it. People who need a roof and a meal can always get it. You know, I don't know how the proposal would exactly work, but I do know that the collaborative effort of humanity in our productivity is greater than it's ever been. And we have so much potential, so much potential. We are stepping among the stars. Whatever it is that we are, this strange fluke of the universe where these chemical proteins combined and in just such a way that allowed us this spark of awareness that makes us who we are. Life, consciousness, this incredibly profound experience that this is, and considering the probability of such a thing happening and you existing in this moment in this time. And humanity has advanced itself painfully and fitfully to the point where now we can absolutely destroy each other. But if we manage not to do that or cook ourselves alive on the cradle of life here, we will travel among the stars. We will be immortal. Life spreading out from the solar system and populating the universe. We are on the doorstep, the very threshold of that. And and sometimes I don't think that we really ever grasp that, especially our leadership. That you know we should be working together as much as possible. We should not be competing as aggressively as we are with one another and stepping on each other's necks, and figuring out a way to just collaborate and share, and not, I'm worried about keeping mine and get mine just like anybody else. And I think that you can do that in a way where you have an incentive where you're also pitching in, you know, there's a balance there. I think that that's absolutely true. I don't think that you can absolutely command an economy and make everybody completely equal that way, because it'll fall apart. Human nature is human nature, but I think we can do a better job collaborating nonetheless. And as I get older, it feels more disheartening because it's not that I don't think it'll get better, but I don't know if it'll get better in my lifetime. I take a very long view of things, and I think about how far human beings and humanity and civilization has come from the god kings of old, who ruled with absolute authority and could say whatever they wanted and do whatever they wanted, and just because they were stronger could hit you over the head, all the way to this fit and start toward whatever representative democracies that we've managed to forge out of the relics of the past over the past 200 years. And our scientific advancements are remarkable. We make ourselves live longer and healthier, and we can feed ourselves better, and we can, heal ourselves better, and we can educate ourselves so much better with our technology, and we can develop so many more things and help so many people, and all these other things that we can do, all in our grasp, and we're squandering it. And I do have faith that we'll get it together. You know, I am an egalitarian ultimately because I'm a kind of a free market kind of guy. I don't think controlling a person is the most efficient form of output. It's that simple. I think if you let people do as they will as much as they can in a way that is productive to society, obviously you got to stop crime and all that other stuff. But if you allow people to just do their thing, man, they're going to be productive to the utmost of their capacity because they'll have their own incentives for a productive life. And that doesn't necessarily mean money. A priest is a vocation. And, we can argue about religion and all that other stuff, but that can be a fulfilling life if that's what you want to do. And we should let anyone who wants to do that, or be a fireman or a, policeman or woman, whatever, right? As long as they can do the job. I think that's fair. But slavery is not just immoral, for example, but it's also not productive. You're not going to get the most output out of those people if you're having to put whips to their backs. You're not going to get the best job out of those people. They're going to be miserable and they're going to be resentful. Now, your costs are low because you're denying them their basic human dignity, but you're not creating the most that you can out of that situation and being productive. The problem is you don't want to share. Now, I think it's fair to say if I bought the tractor that I get a bigger share of this field. I think you don't have to be a miser about it. You can turn $1 into two and not be a jerk. Treat your workers well. Treat them with dignity and respect. Recognize that they're human beings with families and stuff. And business is business. And sometimes you have to make hard decisions and all those other things. That's fair. But treat people with dignity, man. If you're closing up shop, you know what's coming. You don't need to slam the door on everybody all of a sudden. Let them know, hey man, this business is not doing so well, and I don't know if we're gonna make it the next 6 months. Here's the skinny. I've worked at a company like that when I was at COVID, during COVID, FM Systems. They did pay cuts around the board, and they said this is the first thing we got to do because we have lost a significant amount of income, and this is not what we want to do. Whatever. They gave everybody like a 5% pay cut. It sucked, but the board took a big one too. They took a bigger than 5% pay cut. Everybody that was in leadership took a much bigger pay cut. And I thought that was cool. That was cool, because at least, hey, man, you're in it with us. And then what they finally did was they figured out the middle managers that they could get rid of. And they said, okay, we're laying this person and this person and this person off. Their roles are redundant, because of our, reorganization or whatever. And I think it was fair. When I consider the structure of that company, I don't think those two people needed to be there. And then they said, we're going to raise the salaries back to where they were. That was also cool. It was a rarity to work with a company like that, where even at a time of struggle, at least you felt like, okay, well, we're all in this boat together. You know, it's not the standard CEO, this pains me more than you, off y'all go. I'm off to buy my second yacht. You know what I mean? Like, and we see it. That's the thing. We see it. They're out in the open with it. Their disdain for the worker is obvious most of the time. You got guys like Jamie Dimon, you know, Jerome Powell talking about disciplining the labor market and stuff. All these guys that are in charge, they don't like you. They don't like paying you. They don't want you to have money. They want to keep as much of it for themselves. And those are the people we got to topple out of power. I don't know how to do it, but that's got to happen if we're going to reclaim our dignity. If we're really going to make America great again, we really shouldn't be looking back to the 1960s and 50s for how to do it. We should be looking back to the 1930s and the 20s and the 1890s and the way those people stood up even to a government that was violent to them and say, we're not working. We're not going to let any scab come in here and work either until you come to the table and negotiate a fair deal for all of us. Because we're the ones putting the skin in the game. Our lives are on the line here. You're making a boatload of money off of all of us. We get some of it. It's fair. But we have to fight. And we just don't seem to have the spirit lately. And that's what makes me feel a little grim about it. But who knows? That's it.